China is building a military machine at a pace that should make every country around the South China Sea pay attention. Warships are multiplying. Artificial islands are appearing where there used to be reefs, and Beijing is pushing its maritime presence farther across the Pacific. For the Philippines, this isn't some distant geopolitical headline. It's home. Because while China expands its ability to project power, the Philippines sits directly on one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate on the planet. And Manila has a problem. It can't simply outbuild China. Trying to match a superpower ship for ship would be like challenging a heavyweight boxer because you bought new gloves. Ambitious, not especially wise. So the Philippines is taking a different approach. Modernize, strengthen its defenses, build powerful partnerships, and make aggression increasingly costly. But before we get to the Philippine response, we need to understand what Manila is responding to. China has spent years asserting sweeping claims across the South China Sea through its controversial Nine-Dash Line. In 2016, an international arbitral tribunal ruled that China's expansive historical rights claims had no legal basis under the applicable international law. Beijing rejected the ruling, and when a legal decision doesn't end the argument, the next contest moves to the water. China has carried out enormous land reclamation projects across disputed features since 2013, creating thousands of acres of artificial land in the Spratly Islands. These aren't tropical vacation spots. They include airfields, naval facilities, radar systems, and missile-related infrastructure. Why does that matter? Because an artificial island is more than a patch of concrete. It can extend surveillance, support aircraft, provide naval access, and push China's military reach farther from the mainland. It's basically a military extension cord stretched across the ocean. And Beijing's construction has continued. In late 2025, satellite imagery showed large-scale activity at Antelope Reef in the Paracel Islands, where a submerged reef was being transformed into a much larger artificial island. Construction patterns suggested the potential for a long runway and military facilities, so China's strategy isn't just about claiming territory. It's about creating the infrastructure to enforce those claims. And then comes the part that makes this even harder for Manila: gray zone pressure. Chinese Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia have operated around contested waters, including areas involving Philippine fishermen and resupply missions. No invasion fleet, no formal declaration of war. Instead, ships appear, patrol, block, pressure, and leave, only to return again. It's the geopolitical equivalent of someone constantly standing 3 inches inside your doorway and insisting they're not actually inside. The objective is to apply pressure without triggering a full-scale conflict. And that creates a dangerous new normal. Every encounter tests how much pressure Manila will tolerate. Every successful act of coercion can make the next one easier. That's why this isn't simply a dispute over reefs and rocks. It's about sovereignty, economic security, fishing grounds, maritime access, and who gets to shape the rules of the South China Sea. And the stakes extend far beyond the Philippines. The South China Sea is a crucial trade route connecting major economies, while also containing valuable fishing grounds and potential energy resources. So this isn't an empty patch of blue water. It's an economic highway, a strategic corridor, and a military chessboard all at once. Which brings us to the biggest question. How does a middle power push back against a much larger neighbor? The Philippines knows it cannot build a military equal to China's. So instead, Manila is changing the calculation. The goal isn't to become stronger than China. The goal is to become difficult enough to intimidate that aggression stops looking attractive. That is deterrence, and it's driving a major shift in Philippine defense strategy. For decades, the armed forces of the Philippines focused heavily on internal security. Now the emphasis is increasingly moving toward external and territorial defense. That means protecting an enormous archipelago spread across thousands of islands. Defending the Philippines isn't like guarding one building. It's like trying to protect an entire city after someone scattered the neighborhoods across the ocean. You need ships, aircraft, radar, missiles, logistics, and the ability to know what's happening across vast stretches of water. That's why modernization matters. The Philippines is building capabilities not to win a giant war against China, but to ensure that any attempt to use force comes with serious consequences. And that leads to the next part of the strategy. Because weapons can strengthen a country's defenses, but alliances can multiply them. And once the Philippines starts connecting those alliances together, China's calculation gets a whole lot more complicated. Because the next question isn't simply whether the Philippines can stand against China. It's what happens when the Philippines doesn't have to stand alone. This is where the Philippine strategy gets seriously interesting. Manila has realized something every smaller power eventually learns. You don't necessarily need to become the biggest player. You need to make sure the biggest player can't isolate you. At the center of that strategy is the United States. The Philippine-American Mutual Defense Treaty remains the foundation of the relationship, and in 2026, it reached its 75th anniversary. Washington has also reaffirmed that the treaty applies to armed attacks against Philippine armed forces, public vessels, and aircraft, including the Philippine Coast Guard, in the South China Sea. And that matters because of the gray zone tactics we just discussed. When pressure involves Coast Guard vessels rather than destroyers, every incident becomes a test of how far Beijing can push without triggering a wider response. But Manila isn't putting all its security eggs in one basket. Japan has become an increasingly important partner, with negotiations for a reciprocal access agreement moving toward completion. Such an agreement would make it easier for Japanese and Philippine forces to train and operate together. It may sound like paperwork. In military strategy, paperwork can be powerful, because saying, "we support each other," is one thing. Having the legal and logistical machinery to actually train together is another. And then there's France. In March 2026, the Philippines signed a status of visiting forces agreement with France, its first such pact with a European country. Why is that significant? Because France isn't simply watching the Indo-Pacific from a comfortable distance. It has territories and military interests in the region, giving Paris a direct stake in regional stability. Australia is also becoming a major partner, with the two countries announcing in August 2026 their intention to finalize a defense cooperation agreement within the year. So suddenly, the Philippine Defense Network includes the United States, Japan, Australia, France, Canada, New Zealand, and others. But a pile of agreements isn't automatically a military strategy. If 7 countries show up with 7 different radios, procedures, and plans, congratulations, you've created the world's most expensive group project. That's why exercises matter. Balikatan has evolved from primarily a bilateral US-Philippine exercise into a much broader multinational event. In 2026, roughly 17,000 troops participated from the Philippines, United States, Australia, Japan, Canada, France, and New Zealand. And the exercise reportedly included a shared mission network connecting multiple forces. That is important because modern warfare isn't only about weapons. It's about information. Who sees first? Who communicates first? Who coordinates first? If one country's sensors detect a threat, another country's aircraft respond, and another country's forces receive the same information. The combined force becomes far more capable than the individual pieces suggest. That's interoperability, and it is one of the Philippines' most important strategic goals. But there is another message being sent. The Philippines is effectively saying, if you pressure us, you aren't dealing with us in isolation. And that's why the South China Sea is becoming an international issue. The waterway carries enormous volumes of global trade and connects some of the world's most important economies. So if the rules governing those waters can be changed through pressure, the consequences won't stop at Philippine shores. This is also why observers from countries such as the United Kingdom and the Netherlands are paying attention. The larger the network becomes, the harder it becomes to frame the dispute as simply China versus the Philippines. Now, China is watching too. Large multinational exercises can trigger increased Chinese military activity of their own, creating a cycle of action and reaction. The Philippines exercises. China responds. The Philippines strengthens partnerships. China increases patrols. And around it goes. It's a geopolitical game of chicken, where everyone brought warships. But the objective is not to make war easier. It's to make war less attractive. That's why Philippine modernization matters. BrahMos coastal defense missiles give Manila a powerful anti-ship capability. New offshore patrol vessels strengthen maritime presence. Landing platform docks improve the movement of troops and equipment. Additional FA-50 aircraft strengthen air power and response. None of these systems makes the Philippines equal to China, and they don't have to. The real goal is to change the calculation. The question isn't, can the Philippines defeat China? The question is, can China achieve its objectives without triggering military, political, and diplomatic consequences far larger than the prize? Suddenly, the answer becomes much less comfortable. China may have more ships, aircraft, missiles, and resources, but the Philippines has something that can't be measured simply by counting warships. Geography, international partnerships, and a growing network of states with an interest in a free and stable Indo-Pacific. That may become Manila's most important defense asset, because the future of the South China Sea won't be decided only by who has the biggest navy. It will also be decided by who builds the strongest network, maintains credibility, and prevents confrontation from becoming catastrophe. And that leaves us with the biggest question. Can the Philippines make deterrence strong enough to preserve peace? Or will the growing military presence on both sides eventually make a dangerous incident more likely? Because one collision, one miscalculation, or one confrontation could change the entire equation. The Philippines is betting that stronger defenses and stronger partnerships can prevent that moment from ever arriving. China may have built artificial islands. The Philippines is building something different, a network. And sometimes the most powerful defense isn't being the biggest country in the room. It's making sure you never have to stand in that room alone. So what do you think? Can the Philippines' growing military capabilities and expanding alliance network genuinely deter China? Or is Beijing's military advantage simply too large? Let me know in the comments. And subscribe for more deep dives into the infrastructure, military modernization, and geopolitical moves reshaping the Philippines and the Indo-Pacific. Because the map is changing, the alliances are changing, and the Philippines is no longer just watching from the sidelines. It's preparing to play the game.